Over 3 millennia ago, a great and terrible tempest surged across the sun-drenched lands, cradling the Mediterranean. Cities that had pulsed with life were smothered in ash. Empires that were the epicenters of commerce and learning dissolved one after another, as if they were nothing more than mirages. Within the scant chronicles that survived the devastation, a single, chilling name echoes through time: invaders who came from the sea. The world of antiquity knew them as the Sea Peoples. They were enigmatic warriors who commanded unfamiliar vessels, brandished weapons of a design never before witnessed, and spoke in tongues no one could decipher. Their point of origin was a complete mystery, yet their coming sent tremors through the foundations of the known world. In a strange twist of history, we understand little more about them today. Their beginnings are shrouded, their motivations remain a subject of debate, and their true identity feels as though it was deliberately scoured from the annals of time. Our knowledge is pieced together from the accounts of their victims, the very civilizations that trembled before the terror they unleashed. Were they a tide of refugees cast out from homelands that were collapsing around them? Were they merciless consortiums of pirates, or a meticulously organized military force determined to shatter the global order of their day? 3,000 years have not been enough to furnish an answer. Archaeologists continue to hunt for their scattered fingerprints, and historians are locked in ceaseless argument. It is possible that somewhere, buried deep beneath the dunes of ages, the truth about one of history's most profound puzzles lies in waiting. This is the tale of the Sea Peoples, and of the epic they cast into the long shadow of oblivion. We will follow the wake of nameless ships, track the movements of unknown warriors, and leaf through the lost chapters of our past to illuminate a story that has never been fully told. The story of who the Sea Peoples were, and why their specter continues to haunt our collective history. To grasp the shockwave that the Sea Peoples' arrival sent through the ancient world, one must first picture the Mediterranean as it was before the crisis, a realm of dazzling connection, immense wealth, and profound vulnerability. Between the 14th and early 13th centuries before the Common Era, the lands of the Mediterranean and the Near East had entered a golden age of development. Civilizations throughout the region were not merely flourishing in isolation. They were intricately woven together by immense networks of trade and diplomacy. To the south, the new kingdom of Egypt, under the command of pharaohs like Thutmose III and Ramesses the Great, had reached the zenith of its influence. Colossal temples clawed at the sky along the Nile, monuments to the pharaohs' staggering wealth and limitless ambition. Egyptian cargo ships journeyed to faraway ports, returning with precious cedar from Lebanon, copper from Cyprus, and rare jewels and exotic spices from the fabled land of Punt. In the north, stretching across the Anatolian highlands, the Hittite Empire had risen as a truly formidable power. From their heavily fortified capital of Hattusa, they governed the vital trade arteries connecting the Near East to the Balkans. The Hittites were not just accomplished soldiers, but also brilliant diplomats, and they left behind vast libraries of correspondence that paint a picture of a sophisticated world governed by commerce and negotiation. To the west, the Mycenaean civilization held sway over the Greek mainland from mighty citadel palaces at Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos. These were formidable city-states, capable of fielding large armies and renowned for their advanced metalwork, and a ruling class that dwelled in lavish luxury. From their shores, Mycenaean merchant vessels fanned out across the sea, their holds filled with wine, olive oil, distinctive pottery, and finely crafted weapons. In the east, the port cities of the Levant, Ugarit, Byblos, and Sidon, functioned as the essential junctions in this continental trade system. Ugarit, in particular, blossomed into a cosmopolitan hub of culture and commerce, and it was here that the world's first true alphabet was conceived, the ancestor of so many modern scripts. Farther south, the land of Canaan, which would one day see the emergence of new peoples, was a territory rich in promise and held under the influence of the great empires, its people playing an active role in maritime trade. What bound these great powers together was not merely military might or hoarded gold, but a delicate and complex web of trade that spanned sea lanes and overland caravan routes. Aboard great sailing ships, essential raw materials, especially the copper and tin needed to forge bronze, were in constant motion. Archaeologists have discovered time capsules of this era, like the shipwreck at Yalubran off the Turkish coast. Its cargo a breathtaking collection of treasures from every corner of the ancient world. It is a stunning testament to the deep economic integration of the age. And yet, this very interdependence was also their Achilles heel. If the trade routes were ever severed, if a single vital link in the great chain was ever broken, the entire system was primed for a catastrophic, cascading failure. Furthermore, many of these great civilizations, while appearing invincible on the surface, were built upon centralized and brittle structures of power, leaving them dangerously exposed to any sudden shock. No one could have predicted that in the span of a few decades, an unknown force from over the horizon would shake this entire world to its very core, igniting one of the most devastating collapses in the story of human civilization. At the very heart of this flourishing world was the intricate and far-reaching network of trade, a system upon which every great power depended, an invisible thread that tied all their fates into a single knot. Picture a vessel departing the harbor of Ugarit on a windless morning. Upon its deck are barrels heavy with precious copper, the prized metal extracted from the island of Cyprus, famous for its abundant mines. Stored alongside the copper are even rarer ingots of tin, perhaps brought from Anatolia or from more distant lands like the Caucasus or even the British Isles, territories that demanded long and dangerous journeys to bring their metals to the Mediterranean markets. The fusion of these two metals, bronze, was the essential material for crafting swords, armor, tools, and even elaborate jewelry. Without a steady supply of bronze, the armies and economies of the great empires would grind to a halt. It was the lifeblood of the era. But this ship carried far more than just metals. On board were immense logs of cedar from the mountain forests of Lebanon, a treasured timber used for the construction of warships, the grand beams of palaces, and the sarcophagi of the elite. There was gold from Nubia, gemstones from the Sinai, aromatic resins from the Arabian Peninsula, and a vibrant purple dye, squeezed from sea snails, that was intensely coveted by the royal courts of the East. Fleets of such ships connected Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, Greece, and the islands of the Aegean. In Hattusa, the Hittites imported horses and tin while exporting early iron goods and luxurious textiles. In Mycenae, treasures excavated from royal burials reveal artifacts from as far away as Cyprus, Egypt, and the Near East, irrefutable proof of a dynamic, interconnected marketplace of ideas and goods. Each merchant and every ship was a single, tiny link in this immense chain. This network was not only a conduit for material wealth, it was also a highway for concepts, technologies, spiritual beliefs, and languages. The pioneering alphabets of Ugarit, sophisticated metallurgical techniques, and even ancient myths and legends all traveled across the sea on these trading missions. Yet this profound interdependence also left these civilizations more fragile than they had ever been. When the tin shipments were delayed, when pirates or warfare disrupted the trade routes, the consequences were not just the loss of a particular commodity, but the potential disintegration of entire economic systems. Looking back at this period, we cannot ignore the singular importance of the Bronze Age itself, one of the cornerstones upon which the world had built its prosperity on the eve of the approaching crisis. Why bronze? And why would an entire epic hinge so precariously on this one alloy? In that era, iron had not yet been mastered for large-scale, reliable production. Bronze, the alloy of copper and tin, was the strategic material of the day. It was essential for forging the swords, spears, arrowheads, and armor of armies, as well as the fundamental tools for agriculture and construction. Without bronze, armies would lose their battlefield advantage. Craftsmen could not produce their fine wares, and both commerce and production would falter. But here is the critical vulnerability. Copper and tin were not distributed evenly across the lands of the Mediterranean and Near East. To ensure a consistent supply, civilizations were forced to create long and complex trade routes that passed through the hands of many intermediaries. Copper was mined in abundance on Cyprus, the era's primary production center. But tin, which was far more scarce, had to be imported from distant lands. Some sources lay in Anatolia or the mountains to the east, but some historians propose that a portion of the tin supply traveled from as far away as Central Europe or even the British Isles through labyrinthine and treacherous networks of exchange. For this reason, the great powers of the age were locked into a state of mutual dependence to maintain their military and economic vitality. No single kingdom controlled all the resources required to function independently from this shared system. This reality created a world where international relations were not a choice. They were a necessity. The pharaohs of Egypt conducted skillful diplomacy with the kings of the Hittites. The Mycenaean city-states fought for control over key maritime passages. Cities like Ugarit grew into vital hubs where merchants from across the known world converged to trade goods and share intelligence. We know this not just from archaeology, but also from surviving diplomatic archives, such as the clay tablets found at Amarna and Ugarit, which show kings sending one another gold, copper, horses, artisans, and even royal brides to cement their alliances. But this deep reliance was a double-edged sword. If one link in the chain snapped, if a source of tin dried up, if a trade route was blockaded by war or piracy, the entire system risked a catastrophic, cascading collapse. Modern scholars often liken the Bronze Age world to an early form of a globalized economy. And like any globalized economy, it operated smoothly when all its parts worked in harmony, but was terrifyingly fragile when confronted with sudden, systemic shocks. At the time, few could have perceived that such shocks were already gathering strength in silence. And when they finally made impact, the entire world order of the Bronze Age would crumble with a speed that no one could have ever imagined. No matter how masterful the ancient kings were, and no matter how extensive their trade networks, there were forces that lay beyond human control. The first intimations of a gathering crisis began to emerge not from the world of men, but quietly from nature itself. Modern climate science, which combines data from ancient ice cores, tree-ring analysis, and lakebed sediments, has revealed that in the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, the Mediterranean and Near East endured a period of severe climatic instability. Extended droughts ravaged harvests, especially in regions that were highly dependent on rainfall for agriculture, such as Canaan, the Levant, and even parts of Upper Egypt. Tree-ring studies from Anatolia display years of stunted growth, a clear signature of prolonged water shortages. Furthermore, sediment layers from lakes in the Levant show drastically reduced rainfall cycles, a pattern that aligns with periods of social turmoil documented in ancient texts. In an economic system that was heavily reliant on agricultural surplus and grain imported via sea routes, the great kingdoms began to feel an intensifying pressure. Food grew scarce. Prices skyrocketed. Hunger began to creep through the countryside, the very regions that had long supplied soldiers and laborers to the royal courts. But nature's fury did not stop with drought. Violent earthquakes, now confirmed by evidence of fault line activity and sudden structural collapses at archaeological sites, toppled key cities. Ugarit, Hattusa, Mycenae, and many other urban centers show signs of destruction by earthquake either just before or during the waves of violent invasion. Walls did not crumble from the force of battering rams, but from the power of the earth itself. Storehouses were buried, and once magnificent temples were reduced to heaps of rubble. In a world where a king's legitimacy was tied to his perceived ability to shield his people from the whims of nature, such disasters dealt a profound psychological blow. Beyond the physical evidence, surviving diplomatic letters also provide a chilling glimpse into the mood of the era. From clay tablets excavated in Ugarit, we can read desperate appeals for assistance, Reports of food shortages, civil disturbances, and streams of migrants abandoning drought-stricken lands. These messages reveal a world that was cracking from within. An interdependent system, once thrown into disarray by nature, struggled to preserve even a semblance of order. It was within this context, as food supplies dwindled, natural disasters struck, and social tensions simmered, that the Sea Peoples would make their appearance. But were they the cause of this collapse, or merely an inevitable consequence of a world that was already coming apart at the seams? That question, even today, remains unanswered. Perhaps the most visceral portrait of a world being undone is found not in the cracks in the earth, but in the trembling words inscribed on small tablets of clay, letters of desperation passed between kings, now unearthed from the ruins of the city of Ugarit. In its prime, Ugarit was a prosperous commercial center on the coast of the Levant, a vital crossroads in the region's economic web. The city was not just wealthy, but also remarkably sophisticated in its administration and literacy. It is here that archaeologists have discovered more than 1,000 inscribed clay tablets that document transactions, treaties, and diplomatic correspondence. Among them are letters that still send a shiver down the spine when they are read today. One such letter, sent by the king of Ugarit to the king of Cyprus as enemy forces drew near, pleads, "The enemy is at our gates. My city is in dire peril. Send reinforcements and food immediately, if you can. If you cannot, I fear that Ugarit will be unable to hold." Those simple, desperate words reflect a world once accustomed to the ceremonies of trade and diplomacy, now violently thrust into a primal struggle for survival. The letters also reveal the breakdown of the trade system itself. In one message to the king of Alatia, or Cyprus, Ugarit's king complains that his merchant ships can no longer make port because unknown pirates have materialized off the coast, and he laments that the copper and tin, once delivered with clockwork regularity, have ceased to arrive. When taken together, these scattered details expose a regional economy, once running like a well-oiled machine, now grinding to a screeching halt. And as the trade routes disintegrated, military and food supplies across the kingdoms plunged into crisis. What is particularly poignant is how the tone of these letters transforms over time. In the earlier tablets, one finds formal greetings, invitations to exchange lavish gifts, and negotiations for royal marriages, all reflecting a world of confident and prosperous rulers. But in the final letters from Ugarit, written just moments before the city was annihilated, that confidence has vanished. It has been replaced by panic, frantic appeals for aid, and raw, palpable fear. Kings who once saw themselves as standing at the pinnacle of power were reduced to writing desperate messages, as vulnerable as any of their subjects. And then, one day, Ugarit was destroyed. When archaeologists uncovered these tablets, many were still resting on writing desks, their messages unsent. Those final, undelivered letters remain a searing testament to a world unraveling. In every line pressed into the damp clay, we can still feel the last breath of a dying age. And it was at this very moment that the Sea Peoples began to emerge from the shadows as the agents, or perhaps the symbols, of the end of that once glorious world. It is difficult to fathom that only a few years before those desperate pleas were hastily etched into clay, the cities of the Mediterranean were still bathed in an atmosphere of rare prosperity and self-assurance. Ugarit, for instance, was not just a bustling seaport, but also a major cultural nexus. In the grand residences of merchants and nobles, exquisite pottery, jewelry of gold and silver, and intricately carved figurines were displayed with pride, evidence of a wealthy class that cherished beauty and spared no expense in adorning their lives. A constant flow of merchant ships sailed in and out of the harbor. The markets teemed with silks, spices, colored glass, and precious metals from every corner of the known world. On the walls of public buildings, skilled artisans depicted scenes of gods and ancient heroes, their art reflecting a vibrant and confident culture. Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire, was no less spectacular. Its temples and monumental gates were constructed from colossal blocks of stone, embellished with detailed reliefs. In the palaces, scribes meticulously recorded treaties and historic events, as if time and history itself were theirs to command. To the west, in the Mycenaean city-states, the life of the aristocracy revolved around grand palaces where vivid frescoes covered the walls, portraying thrilling hunts, sacred rituals, and daring sea voyages. Mycenaean warriors, clad in gleaming bronze armor, paraded during festivals, a proud display of their people's strength and tradition. Even ordinary citizens, while not affluent, reaped the benefits of this prosperous, interconnected economy. They wore finer textiles, used better household implements, and had access to luxury items that were once the exclusive domain of the elite. In religious ceremonies, solemn processions carried on as they always had. Priests offered the finest goods to the gods, not only to seek their blessings, but also to showcase their city's wealth and power. And above all, what the people of this age likely felt most keenly was a profound belief in the stability of their world. Kings proudly inscribed their victories and distant alliances onto stone monuments. Merchants eagerly financed long and risky sea voyages. People lived with the conviction that their world, with all its brilliance and complexity, would endure for generations to come. No one could have conceived that in just a few short years, it would all be consumed by fire. Mighty fortresses would be set ablaze. The arteries of trade would be severed. The joyful sounds of festivals would be replaced by desperate cries that echoed across the ravaged lands. And so when we read those final, unsent letters from Ugarit, or when we stand today among the ruins of Mycenae or Hattusa, we see more than just broken stone and shattered walls. We feel a deep and lingering sorrow for a world that once shimmered with confidence and life, now diminished to little more than the faint echoes of a forgotten age. Amid the dazzling tableau we have just painted, the first deep tremors began to stir. They did not announce themselves with a great war, but with words carved into stone, like a faint, chilling premonition from the past. The earliest written evidence we possess of the Sea Peoples comes from a celebrated monument, the Merneptah Stele, or the Victory Stele of Merneptah, erected around 1207 BCE in Egypt. At that time, Pharaoh Merneptah, the son of Ramesses the Great, was grappling with mounting threats on Egypt's western and eastern frontiers. In the inscriptions that celebrate his military victories, alongside accounts of his triumphs over the Lebu and Meshwesh tribes in the west, there appears a seemingly minor detail, one that would crack open the door to one of the greatest mysteries of the ancient world. The inscription declares, Canaan has been plundered, Ashkelon has been captured, Gezer has been seized, Enoam is made as that which does not exist, Israel is laid waste, its seed is no more. And then it adds, the Shur-din, the Shekelesh, the Ekwesh, the Lukka, and the Teresh, those who came from the distant sea, have been defeated, no longer a threat to the land of Egypt. These names, Shur-din, Shekelesh, Ekwesh, Lukka, and Teresh, would later become the critical clues as we attempt to trace the path of the Sea Peoples. What is so striking is how these groups are described. Came from the distant sea, a phrase that is both specific and steeped in ambiguity. No earlier Egyptian records had ever made mention of these peoples. They did not belong to any of the traditional powers that Egypt was accustomed to fighting. Modern scholars speculate that these may have been migrating bands or warrior confederations, appearing for the first time on the stage of history, just as climatic and social upheavals were beginning to intensify. It is also important to remember that Egyptian pharaohs were highly deliberate in how they documented their victories. The fact that these unknown groups from the sea were mentioned in an official royal inscription, like the Merneptah Stele, suggests that the clashes with them were significant enough to be worthy of inclusion in the chronicles of history, a sign that the presence of the Sea Peoples was no longer a minor disturbance. Moreover, the simultaneous mention of Canaanite cities being destroyed in the same passage indicates that these seaborne groups were not just confronting Egypt, but were also making their impact felt across the wider Mediterranean, where fragile systems of trade and political alliances were already showing signs of strain. From these few lines alone, we can already sense a new wave of instability gathering on the horizon, one that even the mighty pharaohs could no longer dismiss. And as we shall see, this was only the overture. In the years that followed, these groups would not confine themselves to coastal raids. They would coalesce into large migratory forces, bringing with them their families, women, children, and all their worldly possessions, pushing deep into the fertile lands of the Near East and reshaping the entire political and economic landscape of the region for the century to come. What was carved into the Merneptah stele still whispers to us across time. A world that had once seemed unshakable was standing on the precipice of its greatest upheaval. If the inscriptions on the Merneptah stele were the first warning bell of the Sea People's presence, then less than 3 decades later, the entire Egyptian world would be forced to confront the full fury of the storm they had become. Around the year 1175 BCE, during the reign of Pharaoh Ramesses III, Egypt was drawn into one of the most decisive battles in its long history. It is a battle we can vividly reconstruct today thanks to the incredibly detailed reliefs carved onto the walls of the Medinet Habu temple in Thebes. Those images, more than 3,000 years old, remain astonishingly sharp and striking, as if they were etched only yesterday. And within them, we see an immense force from across the sea making its arrival, bringing with it not only warriors but entire migrating populations, women, children, and wagons piled high with their possessions, as if they were seeking not just to plunder, but to conquer new lands for themselves. According to the inscriptions of Ramesses III, this coalition of sea peoples included several distinct groups: the Peleset, the Jeker, the Shikalesh, the Denyen, and the Weshish, names that remain the subject of intense scholarly debate today, as researchers continue their search for their true origins. The reliefs depict well-equipped fleets of ships, with large oars and broad sails. Their warriors are shown wearing distinctive horned or crested helmets, carrying round shields, and wielding unfamiliar swords, clear evidence that they were not disorganized bands of raiders, but military force deliberately prepared for large-scale warfare. Ramesses III had anticipated this confrontation. He stationed ambush forces along the coastline and deployed his warships across the branches and mouths of the Nile, the strategic choke points that the sea peoples would have to navigate to push inland. When the battle was joined, the ships of the sea peoples became ensnared in the shallow waters, where they were vulnerable targets for the Egyptian archers and infantry positioned on both banks. The carved scenes show the sea peoples fighting with ferocious courage, but they also depict bodies floating in the river, shattered ships, and migrants being captured or killed. In the accompanying inscriptions, Ramesses III boasts of a resounding victory. Those who came from the sea, I have hurled them back into the sea. They lie scattered upon the sands. None remain to carry word home. Yet behind these triumphant pronouncements lies an undeniable truth. This was not a minor raid. It was a desperate, large-scale migration, a monumental clash between the established power of Egypt and a massive wave of displaced peoples seeking resettlement rather than mere plunder. Furthermore, despite Ramesses III's claim of absolute victory, Egypt was not left unscarred. The Egyptian territories in the Levant, which had long been under pharaonic influence, were permanently lost in the aftermath of this crisis. Egypt's international power was severely diminished, and its domestic economy suffered immensely from the strain of the war. And this was only one piece of a much larger mosaic. While Egypt managed to preserve some measure of stability, many other kingdoms were not so fortunate. The tide of the sea peoples continued its relentless surge across the Mediterranean, leaving a trail of incinerated cities and shattered civilizations in its wake. As we gaze upon the reliefs at Medinet Habu today, we see more than just scenes of ancient battle. We are witnessing a pivotal turning point in history, where an old world was beginning to fade and a new, unstable, and chaotic order was rising from its ashes. As historians meticulously study the surviving records from the Merneptah stele, the reliefs at Medinet Habu, and various scattered textual fragments, They have compiled a list of names intimately associated with the Sea Peoples. This list includes the Shurden, the Shikalesh, the Peleset, the Jeker, the Dinyen, and the Lukka, names that are at once strange and haunting, each one posing questions that have yet to be answered. And what is most astonishing is this. Not a single text written by the Sea Peoples themselves has ever been discovered. Everything we know about them is derived from the records of those who fought against them, primarily the Egyptians, a civilization with a long and meticulous tradition of documenting its military campaigns. Let us take a closer look at these enigmatic groups. The Shurden are often depicted as elite warriors, distinguished by their horned helmets, fine armor, and round shields. Some scholars have proposed a connection to the island of Sardinia, where ancient cultural artifacts show intriguing parallels, but the evidence remains circumstantial. The true origins of the Shurden are still a mystery. The Shikalesh is a name that evokes possible links to Sicily, although, as with the Shurden, this connection is speculative and based mostly on linguistic resemblance. No definitive archaeological evidence has yet tied them to the island. The Peleset are perhaps the group with the clearest historical footprint. A majority of historians agree that the Peleset were the ancestors of the Philistines, who would later settle along the coast of Canaan and found the cities of Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ashdod. Archaeological evidence clearly shows the arrival of a new culture in this region, one with strong Aegean influences that were distinctly different from the native Canaanite culture. The Jeker were another group that settled in the Levant, leaving traces in the region of Dor. Yet their original homeland is a complete blank. No one knows where they came from before they joined the Great Migration of the Sea Peoples. The Dinyen are perhaps the most controversial name on the list. Some scholars link them to the Danuna, an ancient Greek term for the Mycenaeans. If this connection is true, it would suggest that among the Sea Peoples were groups originating from the collapsing world of Greece. But this remains a hypothesis. The Lukka are often associated with the region of Lycia in Anatolia, an area with a long history of seafaring and piracy. But were the Lukka mentioned in the Egyptian texts truly the same people as the Lycians known from later periods? That question, too, remains unanswered. The common thread that unites all these names is this. We do not know where they truly came from. No ancient map records a kingdom of the Shurden or a territory of the Dinyen. No city claims to have been the original homeland of the Peleset before their arrival in Canaan. And no written chronicle from any of these groups has ever been found. This makes the Sea Peoples an exceptionally elusive phenomenon. Were they independent groups of people who were thrown together by circumstance? Or were they an organized confederation with a shared purpose of migration and conquest? To this day, historians have no definitive answer. And it is precisely this ambiguity that ensures the story of the Sea Peoples will forever possess the aura of an unsolved mystery, a true piece of forbidden history lying at the heart of the ancient world. But perhaps what left the most indelible impression of the Sea Peoples, both on the ancient civilizations they encountered and on us today, was not simply their mysterious names, but their striking warrior imagery, preserved in stone reliefs, most famously on the walls of the Medinet Habu Temple. As one walks through the temple's grand colonnades, vivid battle scenes unfold before the eyes, depicting Egyptian soldiers confronting unfamiliar warriors from across the sea, figures who were markedly different from their traditional enemies, such as the Libyans or the Canaanites. Their most distinctive feature is their headgear. Many Sea Peoples warriors are shown wearing helmets adorned with two sharp horns, or at times, wide-brimmed helmets with a tall, projecting crest, a style not seen in either Egyptian or neighboring military traditions. These helmets were not merely functional. They appear to have carried a powerful symbolic meaning, perhaps signifying strength or a distinct cultural identity. This detail alone has ignited decades of debate among historians and archaeologists. Were these ceremonial helmets reserved for leaders, or did they reflect a characteristic warrior tradition that was shared across various Sea Peoples groups? In addition, we see them carrying round shields, some convex and others flat, often with a metal boss at the center designed to deflect blows or to be used as an offensive weapon in close combat. This type of shield was common in the Aegean and Anatolian worlds, but relatively unfamiliar to Egyptian soldiers, who typically favored long oval or rectangular shields. As for their weaponry, the Sea People's warriors wielded short, double-edged swords, large daggers, and, at times, throwing spears. Notably, some reliefs depict them with leaf-shaped swords, a style remarkably similar to weapons discovered at Mycenaean archaeological sites. This observation further strengthens the theory of potential links between the Sea Peoples and Aegean cultures. Their attire is also striking. Many warriors are shown wearing short, fringed skirts with bare legs or light footwear. Such clothing would have allowed for agile movement, ideal for fighting aboard ships or for conducting rapid coastal landings. Taken together, these elements created an image of warriors who were both unfamiliar and formidable. To the Egyptians, who were well-versed in the arms and tactics of their traditional foes, the Sea Peoples must have appeared both alien and deeply threatening. And it was precisely this difference that reinforced the sense that they came from distant lands, bringing with them a distinct military tradition that was not fully integrated with the coastal cultures of the Mediterranean at the time. To this day, archaeologists continue to compare the warrior imagery of the Sea Peoples with artifacts found in Sardinia, Sicily, Lycia, and Mycenaean Greece. Yet, no definitive conclusions have been reached. Every detail, the horned helmets, the round shields, the unfamiliar swords, remains a scattered puzzle piece in a portrait that is still waiting to be completed. When we examine the reliefs of Medinet Habu and the inscriptions of Merneptah, one thing becomes abundantly clear. The Sea Peoples were not merely fleeting shadows passing through history. They were a force powerful enough to be immortalized on Egyptian stone and numerous enough to ignite one of the greatest crises of the Late Bronze Age. But who were they really? This is one of the questions that has kept historians locked in debate for over a century. Two principal theories have emerged. Were they simply daring bands of pirates? Or were they part of a much larger, organized wave of migration that helped plunge the entire Mediterranean into chaos? The first theory, that of piracy, is rooted in the way Egyptian texts describe their earliest encounters with the Sea Peoples. Swift attacks launched from fast-moving ships, sudden raid along the coast, plundering resources, and then withdrawing quickly. These tactics align well with the style of organized piracy, which was already a common feature of the Mediterranean during antiquity. Furthermore, groups such as the Lukka, who were connected to Lycia, a region long associated with seafaring warriors and piracy, seem to support this interpretation. But if they were only pirates, why do the reliefs at Medinet Habu depict women, children, and entire migrating communities? And why, during the major assault under Ramesses III, did the Sea Peoples bring with them wagons loaded with their possessions, livestock, and tents? These are clear indicators of migration, not mere raiding expeditions. This detail opens the door to the second theory, one that is now supported by many modern scholars, that the Sea Peoples represented an organized wave of migration born out of profound upheaval across the ancient world. A severe climate crisis, prolonged droughts, devastating earthquakes, and the collapse of the international trade networks. All of these factors turned once thriving lands into harsh, unsustainable environments. In this context, groups from heavily affected regions, perhaps from Anatolia, the Aegean, or even farther west, were forced to abandon their homelands, carrying their entire communities with them in search of new places to settle. Such mass migrations, when met with resistance from established civilizations, could easily turn violent, transforming into wars and raids. And this may be how the Sea Peoples carved their place in history, not simply as pirates, but as desperate, determined communities willing to fight for their future. Even so, the question remains open. The Sea Peoples may not fit neatly into any single category. They may have been a combination of many different groups, some pirates, some migrants, some professional warriors, and some refugees. It is this very diversity and complexity that makes the Sea Peoples so elusive and so captivating for anyone who is drawn to the deeper mysteries of ancient history. To truly understand their nature, we must explore every theory, sift through every archaeological clue, and study every surviving text. A journey that, the deeper we go, reveals that some parts of history are still not ready to give up their secrets. Debates over the true nature of the Sea Peoples may persist, but the consequences they left in their wake are undeniable, and the city of Ugarit stands as perhaps the most vivid testament to their impact. Situated on the northern coast of the Levant, in what is now modern-day Syria, Ugarit was once one of the greatest commercial centers of the Bronze Age. From its harbor, Ugarit's merchant ships sailed across the Mediterranean, trading in copper, tin, cedarwood, colored glass, fine textiles, and countless other luxury goods. The city was not only wealthy, it was remarkably advanced. The Ugaritic alphabet, one of humanity's earliest writing systems, was invented here, laying the foundation for the Phoenician script and, ultimately, for many of the world's alphabets. The royal palace of Ugarit was immense, housing hundreds of clay tablets that recorded commercial transactions, diplomatic treaties, and royal correspondence. Documents that have greatly enriched modern historians' understanding of the region's political and economic landscape on the eve of the Sea People's onslaught. But all of that changed in a matter of moments. The final, desperate letters of the king of Ugarit, as we saw earlier, clearly reflect the city's growing panic as enemy forces, believed to be the Sea Peoples, closed in. And then, Ugarit vanished from history. Modern excavations at the site of Ras Shamra, where Ugarit once stood, reveal a thick layer of ashen destruction that blankets the entire city. Walls have collapsed, brickwork is blackened with fire, and clay tablets are shattered or fused together by extreme heat. What is most striking is that there is no evidence that Ugarit was ever rebuilt. There are no new layers of habitation, no signs of recovery. The once prosperous city was abandoned forever after the attack. Archaeologists also found many unfinished clay tablets still in their kilns, a sign that the assault struck so suddenly that the artisans could not complete their work. Some diplomatic letters were discovered still lying on writing tables, their messages unsent. All of this speaks to the sheer ferocity of the destruction that Ugarit suffered and to the utter helplessness of its ruling powers in the face of the Sea People's tide. With the fall of Ugarit, a vital link in the Mediterranean trade network was severed. And as that link collapsed, the entire interdependent economy of the region shuddered in response. Today, as we gaze upon the charred walls of Ugarit and the fragmented remnants of its clay tablets, we cannot help but feel a deep sense of loss for a center of wealth, civilization, and creativity that was erased in an instant from the flow of history, as if it had never existed. And Ugarit was only one of many victims of the Sea People's tide, a wave that continued to surge across the Mediterranean world. If the fall of Ugarit revealed the destructive power the Sea Peoples could unleash upon coastal trade centers, then the story of Hattusa, the mighty capital of the Hittite Empire, opens an even more haunting and mysterious chapter. Nestled deep within the Anatolian plateau, Hattusa was once the heart of one of the greatest superpowers of the Bronze Age. The Hittite Empire not only controlled vast territories stretching from Anatolia to the Levant, but also stood as Egypt's chief rival in international treaties and warfare. The city of Hattusa was built across a vast expanse, fortified by massive stone walls, monumental carved gates, and grand royal palaces. Within its archives, archaeologists have uncovered more than 30,000 clay tablets documenting every aspect of Hittite life: law, diplomacy, religion, and war. And then, around 1200 to 1190 BCE, Hattusa was suddenly abandoned. Archaeological excavations reveal widespread signs of destruction and fire across the city. But here lies the mystery. There is no direct evidence that the Sea Peoples attacked Hattusa. At least, no Egyptian records mention such an assault. Yet the timing is too striking to ignore. The abandonment of Hattusa occurred precisely during the period when the Sea Peoples were sweeping across the Mediterranean, as the international system of alliances and trade crumbled all around them. Some scholars suggest that after devastating coastal centers, the Sea Peoples may have indirectly triggered internal unrest within the already weakened Hittite Empire, an empire reeling from a climate crisis, drought, and conflicts with mountain tribes. The final royal letters from the Hittite archives carry a desperate tone, filled with pleas for aid sent from the Hittite king to his vassals and allies, eerily similar to the final letters from Ugarit we encountered earlier. What is certain is this: Hattusa was never rebuilt after its abandonment. The Hittite Empire, once an equal to Egypt, vanished from the historical map, giving way to an era of chaos in which small kingdoms and migrating peoples came to dominate much of Anatolia. What truly happened in Hattusa's final days? Did the Sea Peoples directly assault the city? Or did their broader impact, through the collapse of trade networks and the spread of instability, push the empire into an irreversible crisis? No one can say for sure, but the timing, combined with evidence of broken trade links and a spreading wave of collapse, suggests that the shadow of the Sea Peoples surely loomed over the end of Hattusa, whether by force or by consequence. And that shadow would continue to spread as we follow their trail to other cities of the dying Bronze Age world. As Hattusa lay silent in its ashes, the wave of crisis did not stop in Anatolia. It swept westward across the Aegean Sea and struck at the very heart of the Mycenaean world, the Greek civilization of the Bronze Age. The Mycenaean civilization, renowned for its cities like Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, and Thebes, was one of the Aegean's most powerful commercial and military forces. Its fortified palaces, towering cyclopean walls, and the countless treasures discovered in royal tombs reveal a society that was both prosperous and sophisticated. The Mycenaean system of rule was centered around great palace complexes where the king, the wanax, controlled the economy, the military, religious rites, and diplomacy. Their trade routes stretched across the Mediterranean, exchanging goods with Egypt, the Levant, and Anatolia. And yet, by the late 13th to early 12th century BCE, one Mycenaean city after another began to fall. At Mycenae, excavations reveal thick layers of ash covering architectural remains, clear signs of an intense city-wide fire. Granaries, armories, and residential quarters all show evidence of simultaneous destruction. Pylos, one of the largest administrative centers of the Mycenaean world, met a similar fate. At the Palace of Nestor, clay administrative tablets were hardened in the blaze, which is why archaeologists can still read them today. Yet, ironically, one of the final tablets records orders to mobilize defensive troops and prepare warships, suggesting the attack came swiftly as the city was still organizing its defenses. At Tiryns, one of the strongest Mycenaean fortresses, we find more of the same: collapsed walls and scorched buildings. The entire palace system, once the backbone of Mycenaean power, collapsed within just a few decades. What is most striking is that there are no signs of lasting reconstruction at these sites. The Mycenaean civilization, so dependent on its intricate palace network, was unable to recover. Some scholars argue that this destruction may have been driven by internal unrest or rebellion. But when we compare the timing of the Sea Peoples' campaigns through the Levant and Egypt, and when we consider the royal Mycenaean records concerning naval defenses, many believe that the Sea Peoples likely played a major role in the collapse, whether directly or indirectly. Moreover, in the wake of this destruction, the entire Mycenaean world entered a deep decline. The Linear B script, used by the ruling class, vanished. International trade collapsed. City-states fragmented, retreating into isolated, smaller communities. It was from this void that Greece's so-called Dark Age began, a period that would last for centuries until the Greek world rose again in the archaic and classical eras. As we look upon the charred walls and scorched tablets of Pylos or Mycenae today, it is hard not to shudder. A civilization that once dominated the Aegean, that had challenged the great powers of the mainland, collapsed in a blaze of fire, taking with it the proud palace system that had defined its rule. And though the Sea Peoples are not always clearly named in Greek texts, their shadow remains, an unstoppable wave that swept across everything in its path. While the Mycenaean civilization faded across the Aegean, to the east, in the land of Canaan, the Sea Peoples left marks that would prove even more lasting than material destruction. Deep demographic and cultural changes whose traces can still be seen to this day. Canaan, stretching from the southern coast of the Levant northward toward Byblos, was once a prosperous region. Its cities Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gaza, Gezer thrived as bustling trade hubs. The Canaanites built a rich culture, trading extensively with Egypt, the Hittites, and the Mycenaeans, serving as intermediaries along many of the Mediterranean's great maritime routes. But by the late 13th century BCE, archaeological evidence shows that a powerful wave of change swept through the region. Most notable among the Sea Peoples who settled here were the Peleset, a group that modern scholars almost universally identify as the ancestors of the Philistines, famous in later history. The reliefs at Medinet Habu depict the Peleset as one of the primary forces within the Sea Peoples' assault on Egypt. But unlike some other groups, the Peleset were not completely destroyed. A portion of them, after their defeat in Egypt, established permanent settlements along the coastal lands of Canaan. Excavations at sites such as Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gaza reveal a new layer of habitation appearing abruptly around 1200 BCE, coinciding perfectly with the Sea Peoples' migrations. What is striking is that the material culture of this new layer is markedly different from that of the native Canaanites. Pottery styles reflect late Mycenaean or Aegean traditions. Architectural forms, burial customs, and even dietary patterns all point to a new seafaring population. From this group would emerge the people later known in the Hebrew Bible as the Philistines, key adversaries of the Israelite tribes. The Peleset settlement in Canaan did more than just shift the regional balance of power. It reshaped the demographic map of the Levant. The Canaanites did not disappear, but in many coastal areas, they were replaced or gradually assimilated by these new settlers. Archaeological evidence shows that the Philistines quickly built a strong economy, restored trade networks, and developed a unique cultural identity, blending their deep maritime origins with local influences. This reveals an important aspect of the Sea Peoples' migrations. They were not solely agents of destruction. They were also builders. Some groups chose to settle, adapt, and contribute to the cultural fabric of the lands they entered, leaving marks that would endure for millennia. And so, while the cities of the Mycenaeans crumbled, while Hattusa and Ugarit became ruins, a new chapter was unfolding in Canaan, a chapter the Sea Peoples, through the Peleset, wrote with their very presence upon the land. But perhaps the most profound consequence of the Sea Peoples' wave of destruction was not the cities left in flames, but the collapse of the network that had once connected the entire ancient world. The intricate trade system of the Bronze Age, now shattered beyond repair. For nearly 2 centuries prior, civilizations across the Mediterranean had built a fledgling global economy, one in which vast maritime and overland trade routes linked Egypt, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, Ugarit, Canaan, Cyprus, Anatolia, and even regions beyond. Copper and tin, the lifeblood of the Bronze Age, flowed through this system. Along with it came cedarwood, gold, silver, ivory, precious stones, fine textiles, wine, oil, and countless other rare and valuable goods. Merchant ships laden with cargo once glided across the Mediterranean like shuttles weaving a vast economic web, keeping the complex palace economies of Egypt, the Hittites, and the Mycenaeans humming smoothly. But within just a few decades, that network collapsed entirely. Coastal trade routes were blockaded or severed by the fleets of the Sea Peoples. Once thriving port cities like Ugarit were reduced to ruins. The port of Byblos fell into decline. Alashiya, modern Cyprus, a key supplier of copper, was attacked and thrown into chaos. With the merchant fleets gone, the flow of copper and tin, essential for the production of weapons and tools, came to a halt. This triggered a domino effect. Without bronze, palace economies collapsed. unable to maintain military power or sustain their elite structures. Clay tablets from Ugarit and Pylos reveal that even as destruction loomed, city officials were still desperately trying to organize convoys, request aid, and mobilize their naval forces. But it was all in vain. The trade routes had become too unstable. From that point, the ancient world quickly descended from order into chaos. International alliances unraveled. Diplomatic treaties, once carved in stone as eternal promises, became meaningless as partners either no longer existed or lacked the strength to fulfill their obligations. The palace-based economic system, which relied on a steady inflow of foreign goods, could not survive without trade. Palaces collapsed. Aristocrats lost their power. Artisans found themselves unemployed. Populations were forced to revert to subsistence living. Roads once bustling with commerce grew silent. Warehouses once overflowing with goods stood empty. Docks that had once echoed with the voices of merchants were left with crumbling walls and lonely, weathered mooring posts. For this reason, many historians describe this collapse as one of the earliest examples of the failure of globalization. A world once deeply interconnected and seemingly stable proved astonishingly fragile in the face of sudden upheaval. And when the dust finally settled, the Mediterranean world, as it had been known, was no more. A new order, fragmented, localized, uncertain, arose in its place, ushering in a dark age that would take centuries for humanity to recover from. As the Mediterranean world descended into chaos, the question of the true origins of the sea peoples became ever more urgent for modern researchers. One of the most prominent theories is this: a segment of the Mycenaean population, following the collapse of their civilization, became part of the sea peoples wave, migrating and raiding across the Mediterranean. This theory arises from several compelling observations. First, as we've seen, between roughly 1200 and 1150 BCE, the great Mycenaean palace cities were systematically destroyed. The power structure collapsed, the aristocracy lost its base, and many communities were suddenly cut off from the imported food and goods they had once relied upon. In this environment, many Mycenaean groups were forced to leave their former centers in search of survival. Archaeological evidence shows that after the palace system fell, the population in the Peloponnesian plains declined sharply. Many coastal areas and Aegean islands, once bustling, were abandoned. At the same time, in new regions such as the Levantine coast, a new layer of habitation appeared, bearing clear Aegean cultural traits, particularly in pottery styles, architectural methods, and burial practices. Moreover, the name Dinyen, appearing in the Sea Peoples lists, may be connected to Danuna, the term later used by the Greeks themselves to describe Mycenaean peoples. This has led many scholars to argue that some displaced Mycenaeans, rather than waiting to perish, joined with other seaborne groups, forming armed migrant bands that fought and sought new lands. Yet, this theory faces notable challenges. First, there is no direct evidence that the Sea Peoples who attacked Egypt spoke Greek or bore the distinct symbols of the Mycenaean kingdoms. Second, the cultural diversity among the Sea Peoples was immense, from the horned helmets of the Shur-Din to the round shields of the Peleset, to weaponry and dress styles that varied greatly between groups. This suggests that if the Mycenaeans were involved, they were but one part of a far more complex alliance, not its dominant force. Furthermore, within Greece itself, archaeology shows that some Mycenaean communities did persist after the crisis, especially in rural areas and on certain islands. If the entire Mycenaean warrior class had transformed into sea peoples, such strong cultural continuity within Greece might not have been so apparent. Finally, many researchers caution that equating the Sea Peoples with the Mycenaeans risks oversimplifying what was clearly a very complex phenomenon. Archaeological evidence indicates that the Sea Peoples included a mix of groups from Anatolia, the Balkans, the Aegean, and the Levant. In short, the idea that displaced Mycenaeans contributed to the Sea Peoples wave is well supported, but also contains gaps and uncertainties. And it is precisely these lingering mysteries that continue to fuel the endless fascination surrounding the Sea Peoples, a chapter of history that, the deeper we study it, reminds us that some answers may still lie just beyond our reach. In the effort to unravel the true nature of the Sea Peoples, a second major theory has drawn considerable attention from modern scholars. Could part of the Sea Peoples wave have been linked to migrating groups from the Balkans, particularly the Dorian tribes moving southward during that time of crisis? This theory is grounded in a series of observations from both archaeology and modern genetic studies. According to researchers, in the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, waves of migration from the northern Balkans began moving south in earnest. Archaeological evidence shows that many settlements in the Danube Valley and across the Balkans experienced major upheavals, likely driven by harsh climate shifts, population pressures, or internal conflicts. Amid this turmoil, various tribal groups began moving through Macedonia, Thessaly, and into southern Greece. Among them was the group later known as the Dorians. The arrival of the Dorians in southern Greece coincides closely with the collapse of Mycenaean cities. This has led some scholars to ask, could a portion of the Dorians or other Balkan groups have joined forces with the Sea Peoples, helping to drive a powerful armed migration across the Mediterranean? Archaeological clues offer intriguing hints. New layers of post-collapse settlement in the Peloponnese reveal sudden changes in architecture, burial practices, and pottery styles, reflecting a culture distinct from earlier Mycenaean traditions. Similarly, along the Levantine coast, certain pottery types and construction techniques appear that bear traits associated with the Balkans or northern Greece. While this evidence is not strong enough to definitively prove that Dorians directly participated in the Sea Peoples campaigns, the timing is certainly suggestive. Perhaps most intriguing of all, the rise of ancient DNA research has added new tools to this investigation. Scientists are now analyzing ancient remains from Greece, the Balkans, and the Levant. Preliminary results suggest that during the transition after the Bronze Age collapse, there was an increase in genetic markers linked to Balkan populations within southern Greece and in some coastal Levantine communities as well. This raises the possibility that migrating Balkan groups not only entered southern Greece, but that some may have joined seaborne migrations, becoming part of the Sea Peoples wave that so profoundly reshaped the region. Yet, as with all theories, there are important counterpoints. First, the Dorians, according to later Greek tradition, re-established power in southern Greece after the collapse rather than disappearing. If large numbers of Dorians had transformed into Sea Peoples, their strong cultural presence in later Greek history might not be so evident. Second, the Sea Peoples were a highly diverse coalition. Assigning the Balkans a dominant role risks oversimplifying a phenomenon that clearly included groups from Anatolia, the Aegean, the Levant, and beyond. Finally, while genetic research holds great promise, the available ancient DNA samples remain too limited to draw firm conclusions about the scale and role of Balkan groups within the Sea Peoples. Even so, the theory of migrating groups from the Balkans, particularly the Dorians, playing a role adds an important dimension to our understanding. It reminds us that the Sea Peoples phenomenon was not a simple, linear event, but the result of multiple, overlapping migrations interacting in complex ways. And it is this very complexity that makes the story of the Sea Peoples so mysterious, so multifaceted, and so endlessly compelling, a puzzle we are still striving to piece together today. After weighing the various theories, the idea of displaced Mycenaeans, the migration from the Balkans, many modern scholars have reached what is perhaps the most realistic conclusion of all. The Sea Peoples were not a single, unified ethnicity, nor were they a fixed, long-standing alliance. They were likely a temporary coalition formed from many different groups, each with its own motivations, all swept up in the swirling crisis of the era. This theory is supported by a number of compelling observations. First, as we've seen from Egyptian records, particularly the Merneptah stele and the Medinet Habu reliefs, the Sea Peoples are listed as a collection of highly diverse groups. Shurdin, Shikalesh, Peleset, Jeker, Dinyan, Lukka. None of these groups had a clearly recorded homeland in Egyptian texts. Their military traditions, clothing, and weaponry also varied widely. This has led many scholars to ask, if the Sea Peoples were a unified nation, why are their depictions and descriptions so distinct from one another? The most reasonable answer is that the Sea Peoples were likely a loose confederation formed amid the broader regional collapse. In a world where harsh climate changes, widespread crop failures, and earthquakes devastated cities, where international trade broke down, and where great empires grew weak and lost control of their peripheries, countless groups, from displaced farmers and unemployed soldiers to pirates and desperate migrant bands, may have come together to form mixed, mobile populations moving across the Mediterranean. In this process, loose alliances between these groups likely arose out of pure necessity. Those with superior strength or naval experience would have taken leadership roles, while others joined in pursuit of new lands, wealth, or simply survival. This would explain why, in major campaigns such as the battles during the reign of Ramesses III, the Sea Peoples brought not only warriors but also women, children, livestock, and wagons full of their belongings. They were not simply pirates, but armed migrant groups, with resettlement as one of their ultimate goals. Moreover, archaeological evidence from the Levant shows that the cultural footprints of the Sea Peoples were highly inconsistent. Some sites reflect strong Aegean influence, others Anatolian, and still others a blend with local traditions. This further supports the idea that the Sea Peoples were not a homogeneous bloc, but rather the product of many migrating peoples and forces converging amid the chaos of the time. And perhaps the most compelling aspect of this theory is that it reflects the true, volatile nature of the era. As the old world order collapsed and palace systems failed to protect their populations, people had little choice but to move. And in an age of turmoil, military strength became a critical means of survival. Thus, from a patchwork of disparate groups, a loose Sea Peoples coalition emerged, part fighting force, part refugee wave, seeking places to endure. Such a coalition could dissolve upon reaching new lands or evolve as circumstances changed, which helps explain why their historical traces appear so fragmented and elusive. For this reason, many scholars today view the idea of a temporary, hybrid alliance as the most plausible and fitting explanation, and also why the mystery of the Sea Peoples continues to resist any final, simple answer. Of all the theories surrounding the rise of the Sea Peoples, perhaps the most compelling is the one that centers on the climate crisis, because it offers insight not just into the Sea Peoples themselves, but into an entire world that was fracturing at its very foundations. Modern climate studies, combining ice core analysis, tree ring data, lake sediment records, and pollen evidence, show that in the late 13th and throughout the 12th centuries BCE, the Mediterranean and Near East experienced a prolonged and severe drought. These drought cycles may have lasted anywhere from 50 to 150 years, deeply impacting the rain-dependent agricultural systems of many regions. In the Levant, sediment cores show sharp declines in rainfall, which in turn led to major drops in wheat and barley production. In Anatolia, tree ring studies from ancient pines reveal years of stunted growth, a clear sign of repeated crop failures. Meanwhile, in regions like the Aegean and the Balkans, with their rugged mountainous terrain and limited fertile soil, food shortages would have become even more dire as the climate deteriorated. Against this backdrop, societies that had long depended on trade networks and centralized palace economies began to lose their stability. As food became scarce, prices soared, public unrest grew, and the lower strata of society were pushed toward desperation. With few options left, many groups were forced to abandon their homelands, joining waves of mass migration. Yet, they were migrating through a world where much of the old political order had already collapsed, and where the remaining fertile lands were now concentrated in scattered coastal cities or river valleys. Conflict was all but inevitable. Moreover, in such an unstable world, isolated migrant groups could not easily defend themselves. Thus, many chose to band together, forming armed coalitions capable of both protecting their members and seizing resources when necessary. And so, from desperate farming communities unemployed soldiers, and displaced nomadic peoples, the alliances that became known as the Sea Peoples began to take shape. In this view, the Sea Peoples were not the original cause of the collapse, but a direct consequence of a deepening climate and social crisis. Yet, as these migrating groups moved across the region, their very presence accelerated the collapse already underway. Cities were destroyed, trade routes severed, and farmers driven from their fields, creating a spiraling cycle of violence and displacement. Archaeological evidence strongly supports this interpretation. Destruction layers in cities such as Ugarit, Mycenae, and Pylos align closely with the known period of extended drought. And in the Levant, new populations appear in the archaeological record at precisely the moment when palace networks and trade systems were breaking down. Many scholars today believe that this combination of climate crisis and violent migration was likely the single most powerful driver behind the Sea Peoples phenomenon. A world that had relied on climate stability and the prosperity of trade, once stripped of those foundations, could not help but descend into waves of violence and migration. And in this spiral, the Sea Peoples were neither pure villains nor mere victims, but the most visible symbol of an era coming undone. But the deeper we dig into the story of the Sea Peoples, the more we run up against what may be the greatest wall of uncertainty in the entire mystery. We do not truly know where they came from. Across thousands of clay tablets, countless reliefs, and the written records of ancient civilizations, there is not a single line that clearly speaks of a homeland of the Sea Peoples. No nation is named. No king ever declares himself king of the Shur-Den or king of the Pele-Set. No map from the era marks the territories of these groups. Why is that? Part of the reason lies in the very nature of the surviving historical sources, which come largely from the Egyptians, the ones who fought against the Sea Peoples. Remember, Egypt was one of the few great civilizations to survive the Sea Peoples' storm intact, and the Egyptians had a very particular way of recording history. Every inscription, every stele, every relief was meant to glorify the pharaoh's victories, to reinforce the eternal image of royal power. In that style of recording, enemies were always portrayed as barbaric, stateless, and illegitimate, like waves of chaos crashing against the divine order maintained by the pharaoh. Even the way the Sea Peoples are listed in Egyptian texts reflects this approach. Group names are provided with vague descriptors like from the sea or from foreign lands, without clear geographical references or directional markers. This may well reflect the Egyptians' own lack of true knowledge about the origins of these groups. But it may also have been intentional propaganda, obscuring the identity of the enemy while magnifying the perceived power of the pharaoh. Moreover, the Sea Peoples themselves were not centralized empires with advanced administrative systems. They were loose coalitions of diverse groups, many of them migrants, climate refugees, or displaced communities. By their very nature, they left behind no writing systems, no temples recording their history, no royal chronicles. What survives of them comes only through the records of those who opposed them. And as every historian knows, history is written by the victors. Thus, virtually all that we know about the Sea Peoples today comes through the Egyptian lens, a biased lens crafted for political purposes and sometimes prone to exaggerate the pharaoh's achievements. Adding to this, many of the regions from which the Sea Peoples may have originated, the Anatolian coasts, the Aegean, various western islands, were themselves devastated during the Bronze Age collapse. Many cities were burned and never rebuilt. Older writing traditions vanished. The potential sources of first-hand history from the homelands of the Sea Peoples simply did not survive. It is this combination, the Egyptian bias in historical recording and the absence of records from the Sea Peoples themselves, that has left us with a near impenetrable gap in our understanding. And so, even though the Sea Peoples truly shook the entire Mediterranean world of their time, they remain, and may always remain, shadows in the memory of humanity, a strange wave from the past whose echo we can still hear, but whose true shape we may never fully see. While the original homeland of the Sea Peoples remains an unsolved mystery, their post-collapse journey has left much clearer traces on the historical map. One of the most striking examples is the rise of the Philistines, a group that archaeological evidence shows was directly linked to the Pele set, one of the key contingents of the Sea Peoples. As we saw in the reliefs at Medinet Habu, the Pele set played a major role in the Sea Peoples' assault on Egypt. After their defeat at the hands of Ramesses III, part of the Pele set force did not return to the sea. Instead, they settled along the coastal regions of Canaan. It was here, through a gradual process of adaptation and integration, that the distinct Philistine culture emerged, a culture that would shape the political and cultural landscape of the Levant for centuries to come. Archaeological excavations in cities such as Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath have provided clear evidence of this transformation. At Ashkelon, for instance, the archaeological layers reveal a new settlement horizon appearing around 1200 BCE, precisely the period when the Sea Peoples are known to have arrived. In particular, archaeologists have found large quantities of late Mycenaean-style pottery, a type of ceramic that was common in the Aegean but rare in Canaan before this period. This suggests that the new arrivals brought their cultural traditions with them from across the sea. At Gaza, architecture and burial customs also point to the presence of a community whose practices differed markedly from those of the native Canaanites. What is especially fascinating is how the early Philistines initially retained many elements of Aegean culture in their everyday objects, architecture, and rituals. Yet, over time, they blended into their new environment, creating a unique hybrid culture that combines seafaring influences with strong local traditions. This evolution is particularly evident at sites like Ashkelon and Ekron, where later Philistine pottery developed its own distinctive style, no longer a mere imitation of Mycenaean forms. From a genetic standpoint, modern DNA analysis has further revealed that early Philistine populations carried genetic markers consistent with Western Mediterranean origins, reinforcing the theory that a segment of the Sea Peoples, specifically the Pele set, played a foundational role in this community. Thus, from what began as a wave of violent migration, the Sea Peoples, or at least some of their groups, transitioned into stable communities that left lasting marks on the historical record. The Philistines would go on to become a significant force in the Levant, frequently clashing with the Israelite tribes, as recorded extensively in the Hebrew Bible, and contributing to the complex political and cultural tapestry of the region. In this way, while most of the other Sea Peoples groups either dissolved or were assimilated, the story of the Philistines shows us that the Sea Peoples did not merely destroy, they also created. And this, perhaps, stands as one of the clearest examples of how profound crises can forge entirely new orders out of the ruins of the old. After a portion of the Pele set, part of the Sea Peoples wave, settled along the coastal regions of Canaan and formed what would become the Philistine community. One key question has intrigued scholars. Did Philistine material culture truly carry the imprint of Mycenaean civilization? Modern archaeological excavations have provided a very compelling answer. Yes, and in ways both striking and subtle. The most prominent and most thoroughly studied evidence comes from pottery. In the earliest Philistine occupation layers at sites like Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gaza, archaeologists have uncovered a large volume of pottery in the style of late Mycenaean, particularly Mycenaean IC. This type of pottery is distinguished by its intricate geometric patterns, spirals, wavy lines, and designs painted in red or black on a light background, a hallmark of Mycenaean artistry at the twilight of the Bronze Age. Crucially, these pottery pieces in Canaan were not imported from Greece. They were made locally, indicating that the artisans who carried this ceramic tradition had physically migrated and were producing their wares in this new land. This points to a genuine movement of people, not merely the spread of trade goods or artistic influence. Architecture also offers intriguing clues. At Ekron, archaeologists have discovered buildings featuring open porch designs, an architectural element with clear parallels in late Mycenaean domestic structures. The kilns and craft workshops unearth their employed techniques, closely resembling those used in Aegean craft centers. Funerary practices provide further evidence. In early Philistine cemeteries, archaeologists found simple pit burials, sometimes accompanied by grave goods that reflected Aegean traditions, in stark contrast to the typical Canaanite practices of collective tombs or rock-cut chambers. Altogether, this evidence paints a vivid picture. In their earliest phase, Philistine culture bore a strong Mycenaean imprint, visible in their pottery, architecture, and ritual life. But here is where the story becomes even more fascinating. Within 2 or 3 generations, Philistine material culture began to evolve significantly. Mycenaean IC pottery gradually gave way to uniquely Philistine styles, with new shapes and decorative motifs that reflected a blending of influences and local innovation. Architectural forms also began incorporating more Levantine features, and burial practices shifted further toward regional norms. This evolution suggests that the Philistines were not passive bearers of Mycenaean culture. They actively adapted, blended, and reshaped their cultural identity in response to their new environment, forging a distinctive hybrid tradition that honored their roots while embracing the realities of life in Canaan. Today, archaeologists often classify early Philistine culture, circa 1200 to 1150 BCE, as Philistine I, the phase where the Mycenaean imprint is most visible. Later phases, Philistine II and Philistine III, mark the emergence of a distinctly Philistine identity, more localized and richly adapted to their Levantine setting. In this way, the legacy of the Sea Peoples was not limited to layers of ash and ruins. It also flowed into new cultural currents, leaving lasting imprints that enriched the complex historical tapestry of the Mediterranean. And the Mycenaean legacy within Philistine culture stands as one of the clearest and most fascinating testaments to that complex journey. While the traces of the Pele set, the Sea Peoples group who would become the Philistines, have been brought to light through careful archaeological study, the fate of the other Sea Peoples remains far more obscure. And this is not surprising. As we have seen, the Sea Peoples were not a single, unified ethnic group. They were a loose alliance of disparate tribes and peoples, each with its own origins, its own identity, and its own motivations. And as the Great Bronze Age crisis came to an end, many of these groups, if they were not destroyed in battle, gradually blended into the Mediterranean societies where they settled. Within just a few generations, their distinct identities would have largely dissolved. Names that once rang out from Egyptian inscriptions, Shur-din, Shikalesh, Jeker, Dinyen, Lukka, vanish from the historical record. But this does not mean these peoples vanished entirely. It is far more likely that survivors of these groups were absorbed into local cultures, whether in the lands they had attacked or in the regions where they ultimately settled. Consider a few examples. The Shur-din may have established themselves in the Western Mediterranean. Some scholars suggest they contributed to the warrior culture of Sardinia, where the great stone towers known as nuraghi still stand today, silent witnesses to an ancient era of upheaval. The Shikalesh, whose name evokes Sicily, may have similarly merged into the island's native communities, their distinct identity gradually fading into the evolving Sicilian culture. The Jeker left perhaps the faintest trace. At the site of Dor on the modern coast of Israel, archaeologists have uncovered a layer of occupation featuring cultural elements that are not entirely Canaanite. This may reflect the presence of Jeker settlers, though in time, the local culture once again dominated. The Dinyen, possibly linked to the Danuna, a term for Mycenaean Greeks, likely reintegrated into the broader Greek world during its post-collapse migrations and the complex resettlements of Greece's so-called Dark Age. The Lukka, associated with the Lycian region of Anatolia, may have blended back into the Anatolian highland communities, persisting under new names and social structures, no longer connected to the Sea People's identity recorded by the Egyptians. Across all these cases, the pattern is the same. Once the storm of history had passed and Mediterranean civilizations began to stabilize, the scattered Sea Peoples groups could not maintain distinct identities for long. Without formal administration, without written traditions of their own, and without strong cultural institutions to preserve their identity across generations, assimilation was inevitable. And when that happened, names like Shur-din, Shikalesh, and Jeker faded, leaving only faint echoes on Egyptian stele and lingering as tantalizing puzzles for future historians. Today, when we trace the legacy of the Sea Peoples, we are not just reading layers of ash and ruins. We are also deciphering blended bloodlines and cultural identities that quietly transformed Mediterranean civilizations from within. And perhaps this is why, even after more than 3,000 years, the mystery of the Sea Peoples continues to captivate historians and archaeologists alike. For they represent a wave of history that cannot be easily pinned down, a force of human movement and transformation whose consequences and legacies remain subtly woven into the very fabric of Mediterranean history. And so, after tracing every footprint, every layer of ash, and every surviving fragment, we can begin to understand why the Sea Peoples have become one of the greatest mysteries of the ancient world. Not because they never existed. On the contrary, their impact is clearly visible in the archaeological layers, in the ruins of fallen cities, in vanished civilizations. Not because there are no records, for Egyptian inscriptions and layers of material culture in Canaan, the Levant, and the Aegean all tell pieces of their story. But perhaps this is what makes the mystery so compelling. The more evidence we uncover, the more we realize that what we know is only the visible tip of a vast, submerged iceberg. First and foremost, the origins of the Sea Peoples remain elusive. For more than a century, scholars have tried to trace the roots of each group. Peleset to Philistines, Shur-din to Sardinia, Shikalesh to Sicily, Dinyen to Mycenaean Danuna, Jeker and Lukka to parts of Anatolia. And yet, no single theory has proven strong enough to achieve universal consensus. Even in Egyptian records, the Sea Peoples are always described as waves of invaders from the sea, from foreign lands, with no nation, no known kings, and no recorded capital cities. This made them one of the most shadowy, ungraspable foes that ancient civilizations ever faced. Second, the Sea Peoples left behind no written history of their own. There's no Sea Peoples chronicle, no stele proudly recounting their victories from their perspective, no surviving text telling their story in their own voice. Everything we know comes from the other side, from Egyptian records, from scattered archaeological traces, from the ruins of the civilizations they struck and then vanished from. This ensures that their image remains forever half seen, half unknown. We cannot say with certainty how strong they were, how numerous, how organized, or even whether they were a single coordinated force or multiple waves of migration layered upon each other. Third, while the Sea Peoples' impact is undeniable, their material legacy is difficult to trace. They helped bring about or accelerate the collapse of many Bronze Age civilizations. The Hittites fallen, the Mycenaeans devastated, Ugarit burned, many Canaanite cities conquered or transformed. Yet, after the wave had passed, most Sea Peoples groups either merged into local societies or faded from memory. They left behind layers of ash and early ceramic styles showing Aegean influence, but no lasting new civilization that bore the name of the Sea Peoples. Their story is like that of a great wave crashing across history, leaving deep scars in its wake, but the wave itself dissolving before anyone could fully record it. And perhaps it is this very elusiveness that makes the Sea Peoples so endlessly fascinating. We have no shortage of tales about mighty empires with palaces and written chronicles. But the story of the Sea Peoples is the story of outsiders to the official histories, desperate, determined communities whose own voices were never preserved, but who nonetheless reshaped the course of an entire era. And in that very shadowy nature, the Sea Peoples will likely continue to challenge the imagination and patience of scholars, and of all of us, for many centuries to come. But perhaps in this entire journey to understand the Sea Peoples, the most profound question is not who they were, but how history has, or has not, remembered them. For without the inscriptions of Egypt, we might never have known that a wave of sea peoples once shook the ancient world. Nearly everything we know about them comes from Egyptian records. From the Merneptah stele, from the carvings in the temple of Medinet Habu under Ramesses III. It is from these inscriptions that the names Pele-Set, Shurdin, Shikalesh, Jeker, Dinyen, and Lukka were preserved. It is from these reliefs that we see the images of warriors with horn helmets and round shields, and of migrating families, women, children, livestock in tow, moving as part of this great upheaval. Without these records, all the archaeological evidence, the layers of ash at Ugarit, Mycenae, and Pylos, the new settlement layers in Canaan, would have remained isolated clues, difficult to connect into a coherent picture of such a vast wave of armed migration. And yet, this also reminds us of an essential truth. History is written by the victors. It was Egypt, one of the few great civilizations to survive the storm of the Sea Peoples, that recorded this story through its own lens. In the inscriptions, the pharaoh is always the triumphant hero, the Sea Peoples the barbaric invaders who are defeated. There is no voice from the Sea Peoples themselves, no record of their story, as seen through the eyes of those who were forced to abandon their homelands, cross the sea in desperation, and fight to survive. This is what makes the story of the Sea Peoples both fascinating and sobering. For what remains in the historical record is always but one side of a much larger tale. If, one day, a chronicle of the Sea Peoples were to be discovered, assuming one was ever written, the story we know today might look very different. But perhaps that chronicle does not exist. The Sea Peoples, by their very nature, were migrating communities without a strong administrative structure, without an enduring system of record-keeping. And in that sense, they are among the lost voices of history. This, too, is a larger lesson. How many events, how many peoples, how many stories once shook the ancient world, but because no one recorded them from their side, we will never know they existed. The Sea Peoples, by fortune or misfortune, left just enough traces in Egyptian stone for us to follow their story today. But surely, many other Sea Peoples in a long human story have been swallowed in complete silence, leaving behind nothing but layers of earth and stone. And perhaps this is what makes the mystery of the Sea Peoples endlessly compelling. For it is not just their story, but a story about how history is recorded, how human memory is preserved, and how many voices have been forgotten along the way. As our journey reaches the final lines of the story of the Sea Peoples, perhaps an even larger question lingers in the mind. If not for the inscriptions of Egypt, we might never have known that the Sea Peoples had existed. So how many other chapters of human history, how many communities, how many civilizations, how many stories have been completely erased from humanity's memory? The layers of earth we uncover today reveal only the smallest fragments of the past. The written records that remain are the voices of the few civilizations that managed to preserve their history. Behind every carved stone, every broken shard of pottery, every line etched into temple walls lies a vast ocean of things unknown and, perhaps, unknowable. And this is why the journey of exploring history never truly ends. For history is not only what we know, it is also what has been forgotten, buried, or never recorded at all. The Sea Peoples offer one of the most vivid examples of this, an anonymous wave that reshaped the political, economic, and cultural map of the entire Mediterranean, and yet whose identity has all but faded into the sands of time. But they're not the only ones. If the Sea Peoples could shake an entire age, and yet today we still do not know who they truly were, how many other stories have been completely lost, leaving no trace in the written records we now possess. Perhaps somewhere in a distant land, beneath layers of earth yet to be unearthed, clues still lie hidden, fragments that could forever change the way we understand the past. Through every conversation like this, through every story we tell, we help keep these questions alive, so that history remains not a closed book, but an ever-opening door to new discoveries. For this journey, like the history it explores, will never truly come to an end.